A billionaire sits in his luxury mansion sipping coffee, his eyes fixed on two women. One is elegantly dressed and charming, the other humble and quiet. With a sly smile, he slides his platinum credit card across the table. "Buy anything you want," he says, his voice calm but calculating. Neither woman knows they are being tested, and neither imagines that the real test won't come from what they buy, but from what the maid brings back. The morning sun poured through the tall glass windows of Knight Enterprises Tower, casting streaks of gold across the sleek marble floor. At the very top, in an office that seemed to touch the clouds, sat Alexander Knight, a man whose name carried power, wealth, and mystery. At 42, Alexander had everything the world said defined success: luxury cars, private jets, multiple estates across continents, and a net worth so vast that financial magazines called him the billionaire with the Midas touch. Yet behind those sharp grey eyes and calm demeanor lay something colder, a man who no longer trusted anyone. Years of betrayal had sculpted him into someone who believed affection was just another transaction. His fiancée had left him for a rival entrepreneur. His business partner had embezzled millions, and even his closest friends had used his kindness for personal gain. So when people smiled at him now, Alexander saw only one thing: calculated interest. That morning, as he scrolled through yet another list of potential social connections sent by his assistant, he sighed in quiet frustration. "Everyone wants something," he murmured, setting down his cup of black coffee. "Money, fame, comfort. No one simply cares anymore." Standing quietly at the door, Maria, his longtime maid and housekeeper, heard his words but said nothing. For 10 years, she had seen him grow colder with every wound. She knew his heart wasn't cruel. It was simply guarded. Later that evening, Alexander attended a charity gala, the kind of event filled with elegant gowns, crystal chandeliers, and polite laughter that never reached anyone's eyes. That's where he met two very different women who would soon become part of his strange little experiment. The first was Sophie Langford, a woman who moved through the room like a queen. Her dress shimmered under the light, her perfume filled the air with notes of luxury, and her conversation revolved around yachts, vacations, and power. She had charm, wit, and confidence, but behind her practiced smile, Alexander saw ambition, the kind that always came with a hidden price tag. The second was Lena Brooks, a quiet, modest woman with simple taste and gentle eyes. She wasn't dressed to impress. Instead, she spent most of the evening helping the organizers manage donations for underprivileged children. Her kindness seemed effortless, not performed for attention. Alexander found himself watching both women from afar, two worlds standing side by side. One glittered like gold, the other glowed like warmth. And something within him, that cold, analytical mind, whispered that this could be his next test. Back at his mansion later that night, he poured himself a drink and stared into the city lights. "If people are defined by what they desire," he thought aloud, "then let me see what they choose when given the chance." He picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Invite both Sophie and Lena for lunch tomorrow. I want to get to know them." Maria, standing silently by the dining room doorway, raised an eyebrow. "Sir, are you testing them?" she asked softly. Alexander smirked, not denying it. "Let's just say, Maria, I'm testing human nature," the maid sighed, shaking her head gently. "Be careful, sir. Tests reveal the truth, but sometimes the truth changes the tester too." Her words lingered in the air long after she left the room. Alexander looked down at his sleek black credit card, glinting under the chandelier light. He turned it between his fingers thoughtfully, unaware that this simple piece of metal would soon lead to the most unexpected revelation of his life. The following afternoon, the Knight mansion gleamed in its quiet elegance. Sunlight streamed through arched windows, glinting off the polished mahogany furniture. Every corner of the vast dining room whispered of refinement: fine china, silver cutlery, and the faint scent of jasmine from the garden beyond the open glass doors. Alexander Knight sat at the head of the long table, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit. He had an air of control about him, calm, sharp, unreadable. Today, however, there was a spark of mischief in his expression. 2 chairs to his left sat Sophie Langford, radiant as ever, in a cream-colored designer dress that shimmered like pearls. Her diamond earrings caught the light each time she moved. She smiled often, perhaps too often, as if charm were her most powerful weapon. Across from her sat Lena Brooks, dressed simply in a light blue blouse and a floral skirt. Her demeanor was warm, her tone gentle. She thanked the servers for every small gesture and complimented the chef on the soup, earning polite smiles from the staff who rarely received acknowledgement from guests. As they dined, conversation drifted from art to travel to philanthropy. Sophie spoke passionately about luxury villas in Italy and the latest Paris Fashion Week, while Lena quietly shared stories of her work with orphan children and community libraries. Alexander listened, studying every detail, their words, their gestures, their eyes. He wasn't judging wealth or poverty. He was watching intent. When dessert arrived, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. His grey eyes moved between the 2 women. "Ladies," he began smoothly, "I've enjoyed our little gathering, but I have a question, one that might sound unusual." Both women looked intrigued. He reached into his pocket and drew out a black platinum credit card. It gleamed faintly under the chandelier, sleek and elegant, the kind of card that opened any door in the world. "I want each of you to take this card," he said, placing it on the table. "Spend whatever you wish. No limits." Sophie's eyes widened in surprise. Lena blinked, uncertain if she had heard correctly. Alexander continued, his tone calm but probing. "Buy what represents you. Something that shows me who you really are." Sophie gave a light laugh. "You're joking, right?" "Not at all," he replied with a faint smile. "Think of it as a gesture. Call it curiosity. You both intrigued me today. I'd like to know how you see value." Lena hesitated, her brow furrowed. "Mr. Knight, that's very generous, but I'm not sure I'm comfortable using someone else's money." Alexander tilted his head. "Why not? Money is just a tool. The way one uses it often reveals their nature." Maria, the maid, who had just entered to clear the plates, paused for a moment at his words. Her eyes met Lena's briefly, and she gave a small, encouraging smile, as if to say, "Do what feels right to your heart." Sophie, meanwhile, was already intrigued by the idea. "So anything we want?" she asked, a hint of excitement in her voice. "Anything," Alexander confirmed. "Clothes, art, donations, whatever you believe reflects you best. You both have until tomorrow afternoon. Return here at the same time and show me what you've done." Sophie grinned, her eyes flashing with opportunity. "Challenge accepted," she said brightly, already picturing herself walking through luxury boutiques. Lena, still hesitant, nodded slowly. "If this is truly your wish, then I'll do something meaningful with it." Alexander gave a small nod of approval. "Good. I'll be waiting to see what that means." As the women rose to leave, Sophie's heels clicked confidently across the marble floor. Lena walked more slowly, thanking the maid again on her way out. Once the door closed, Maria turned to Alexander, frowning slightly. "Sir, you call it a game, but it feels like you're testing them." He smiled faintly, swirling the last of his wine. "Maybe I am. People always reveal themselves when temptation stands in front of them." Maria sighed, her tone soft but pointed. "Be careful, sir. Sometimes when we test others, the answers we find change us." Alexander chuckled lightly. "Perhaps, Maria, but I'm not the one being tested here." Yet deep down, a strange feeling flickered inside him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. As Maria cleared the dishes, she glanced once more at the gleaming credit card box on the table, empty now, and whispered under her breath, "God help him see what really matters." The following morning dawned bright and full of promise. The city glimmered in the sunlight, sleek cars, tall glass buildings, and people rushing to chase their dreams. Somewhere above that rhythm of ambition, Alexander Knight sat in his study, sipping his coffee and staring out the window. The previous day's experiment lingered in his thoughts. He wasn't testing greed for amusement, or at least that was what he told himself. Deep inside, he wanted to believe that someone out there could look beyond his wealth. See him as a man, not a walking vault by noon. Both Sophie Langford and Lena Brooks had set out on their respective journeys, each with the same card, the same freedom, and the same opportunity to reveal who they truly were. Sophie's luxury car rolled to a stop in front of Regal Avenue, the city's most exclusive shopping district. The sidewalks shimmered with polished glass storefronts, designer brands, and valet attendants waiting with polite smiles. She stepped out gracefully, adjusting her sunglasses, her lips curling into a satisfied smirk. "Let's see what impresses a billionaire," she murmured under her breath. Her first stop was Maison de Lumière, a high-end boutique known for handcrafted dresses that cost more than most people's annual salary. Inside, she was greeted with reverence. The staff recognized the black platinum card instantly. That single piece of metal that could silence any question of affordability. "I'll take the new emerald silk gown," she told the assistant. "And the matching clutch. Oh, and those Italian heels." Hours passed, and Sophie continued her spree. Jewelry, perfume, a new designer watch, even an imported champagne set. Each purchase was deliberate, each item chosen not out of need, but out of a desire to shine. To her, the card was a mirror, and she wanted Alexander to see glamour reflected in it. As she sipped espresso in a high-end cafe, she rehearsed in her mind what she would say the next day. "I chose to honor your generosity with elegance," she imagined herself declaring. She believed that men like Alexander admired sophistication, not simplicity. What she didn't know was that across the street, inside a discreet black SUV, one of Alexander's assistants sat quietly, taking notes. Alexander had instructed his staff to discreetly observe both women's choices. When he received the report later that afternoon, Alexander's expression remained unreadable. "Luxury stores," he murmured, scanning the list. Predictable, but part of him wasn't surprised. He had seen it too many times before. Across town, in a quieter part of the city, Lena Brooks stepped off a bus, holding the same card, but with an entirely different energy. She looked at it not as a ticket to indulgence, but as a strange kind of responsibility. She stopped outside a toy store, pressing the card gently between her fingers. "If this is meant to show who I am," she whispered to herself, "then I can't just use it on myself." Inside, the colorful shelves were lined with dolls, puzzles, and games. Lena moved slowly, choosing each item with care. Picture books for children learning to read, soft toys for the toddlers, and art supplies for the older ones at the orphanage she volunteered for every weekend. When the cashier asked, "All this for a gift drive?" Lena smiled warmly. "Something like that." From there, she visited a small bookstore where she bought educational materials, storybooks, and a few inspirational novels she planned to share with her students. She spent modestly, using just a fraction of what the card could afford. Finally, she walked to St. Mary's Orphanage, a humble building with fading paint but bright laughter inside. The children ran to her as she entered, shouting her name. "Miss Lena, you came early today?" Her eyes softened as she knelt to hug them. "I brought something special," she said, and began unpacking the toys. The children's squeals of joy filled the room, echoing through the halls. One of the nuns, Sister Grace, approached her with tears in her eyes. "You've done so much already, my dear." "You didn't need to," Lena shook her head gently. "I wanted to. Someone gave me the chance to choose what matters. This is what matters to me." Unseen to her, another of Alexander's assistants stood nearby, quietly recording the moment on camera. When Alexander later received the footage, he leaned forward, watching silently. There she was, laughing with children, her hands dusty from unpacking boxes, her eyes shining with genuine happiness. He paused the video halfway through, unable to look away. For the first time in years, a faint smile tugged at his lips. "She didn't buy for herself," he murmured. "She gave." Maria, standing nearby polishing silverware, overheard him and smiled softly. "I told you, sir," she said gently. "Money only reveals what's already in the heart." Alexander turned his gaze toward her, curious. "And what do you think my card revealed today?" Maria looked thoughtful. "That perhaps you're still searching for someone whose soul isn't for sale." He didn't reply. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the window. Outside, the evening sky glowed orange and violet, the color of endings, but also beginnings. By the time night fell, Sophie was parading her new purchases before a mirror, dreaming of admiration. Lena was tucking a child's blanket under his chin, smiling as he fell asleep clutching a new stuffed bear. And miles away, Alexander Knight sat alone in his vast study, his heart beginning to stir with questions he hadn't asked himself in years. Tomorrow, both women would return to show what they had done. But fate had one more player waiting in the wings, Maria, the quiet maid, whose simple act would soon outshine them all. The mansion was unusually quiet that evening. The faint ticking of the antique clock echoed through the marble halls, mingling with the distant hum of the city beyond the tall windows. Maria Alvarez, Alexander Knight's maid, moved gracefully through the living room, dusting the grand piano that had not been played in years. She had served him for over a decade, long enough to see the changes that wealth, loss, and betrayal had etched into his soul. She had seen him when he was kind, years ago, when he used to laugh easily, invite staff to share in holidays, and talk about dreams instead of deals. But after betrayal, the warmth in his eyes had been replaced by cold precision. His life became numbers, contracts and walls no one dared to cross. Yet Maria had remained, not because she needed the job, but because she saw something in him that others didn't, a wounded heart still capable of goodness. That night, she entered the study where Alexander sat before a dimly lit fireplace, reviewing the reports from his assistants without looking up. He asked, "They've both finished, haven't they?" Maria nodded, placing a tray of tea beside him. "Yes, sir. Your driver said Miss Sophie returned home with several shopping bags. Miss Lena, on the other hand, went straight to the orphanage." Alexander's expression remained calm, though his eyes flickered with a glint of curiosity. "So my assumptions were correct," Maria tilted her head slightly. "Assumptions, sir?" He leaned back in his chair. "That people always reveal themselves when given power or wealth. Sophie used the card to buy things that please the eyes. Lena used it for things that please the heart." Maria smiled faintly. "You sound surprised, sir." "I'm not," he said quietly. "But I am." Intrigued, he turned to face her, his tone thoughtful. "Tell me, Maria, if I handed you that card and told you to buy what defines you, what would you do?" Maria froze for a moment, her hands still resting on the tray. She wasn't used to being asked questions like that. "I suppose," she said after a pause, "I'd buy something that makes someone's life easier. Food, medicine, maybe help pay for school fees. I have everything I need already, sir. I sleep peacefully knowing I've done no harm." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "So you wouldn't buy anything for yourself?" Maria shook her head with a gentle smile. "When you grow up with very little, sir, you learn that joy doesn't come from owning, it comes from giving." For the first time in years, Alexander didn't have a response. Her words struck deeper than he expected. He looked away, pretending to study the fire, but Maria could see the faint furrow of thought forming on his brow. "You always talk as if money is meaningless," he said eventually. "But without it, life is struggle." Maria nodded. "True, but with too much of it, life can be empty." There was silence, heavy, thoughtful silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Finally, she spoke again, softer this time. "You test people, sir, because you've been hurt. You want to see if anyone can pass. But maybe what you're really testing is whether the world can give back the kindness you've lost." Her words made him look up sharply. Few dared to speak to him that way. Yet Maria's tone wasn't challenging. It was maternal, almost loving. Alexander gave a faint, almost reluctant smile. "You always have an answer for everything, don't you, Maria?" She chuckled quietly. "Not everything, sir. Just the things money cannot solve. As she turned to leave, Alexander's gaze followed her. "Maria," he called after her. She paused at the door. "Yes, sir?" "Tomorrow, when they return, I want you to be here too." "I'd like to hear your opinion on both of them." Maria nodded politely. "Of course, sir. But remember, sometimes the one who watches the test learns more than the ones being tested." She walked out, leaving Alexander alone with the flickering firelight. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He thought about Lena's genuine smile, about Sophie's gleaming jewels, and about Maria's simple answer. Joy doesn't come from owning, but from giving. For a man who had built empires, that was perhaps the one thing he had never truly learned. Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere beyond the mansion gates, a storm was brewing, not in the sky, but within the heart of the man who believed he was immune to emotion. Tomorrow, his quiet world would shift forever, and the lesson he had mocked would come from the least expected place, his maid's humble act of kindness. The next afternoon, the mansion buzzed with a subtle tension. The air was still, heavy with anticipation, as though the house itself understood that something significant was about to unfold. Alexander Knight stood by the tall glass windows of his drawing room, his hands clasped behind his back. Outside, the gardens shimmered under the golden afternoon light. A gentle breeze stirred the roses, their fragrance drifting faintly into the room. He had spent the entire morning reviewing business reports, but found his mind drifting again and again toward the experiment. 2 women, 1 card, 1 truth waiting to be revealed. Behind him, Maria quietly adjusted the tea set on the table. She said nothing, but her eyes followed him with quiet understanding. She knew her employer better than anyone, his pride, his pain, his constant search for proof that goodness still existed in the world. At precisely 3 o'clock, the front doors opened. The butler announced, "Miss Sophie Langford and Miss Lena Brooks have arrived, sir." Alexander turned. His expression was unreadable, but his pulse quickened. "Send them in!" Sophie swept into the room first, radiant as if stepping onto a red carpet. She wore a fitted white dress, newly purchased, her hair styled to perfection, her wrists adorned with the same diamond bracelet she had bought the day before. Her perfume filled the air, expensive, deliberate. "Mr. Knight," she greeted with a dazzling smile, "I must say you have quite the imagination. Your little challenge was thrilling." Alexander motioned for her to sit. "I trust you enjoyed yourself." "Oh, immensely," she laughed lightly, crossing her legs elegantly. "I wanted to honor your generosity properly, so I chose things that reflect refinement, art, fashion, beauty. I believe elegance says the most about who we are." She gestured toward the array of shopping bags her driver carried in behind her. "A few modest pieces," she added, though the total easily exceeded tens of thousands of dollars. Alexander's gaze lingered on the glittering pile. "I see, and all this represents who you are?" Sophie's eyes sparkled. "Of course. I believe in presentation. Power and beauty walk hand in hand, don't they?" There was a pause. Alexander's lips curved in a polite smile. "Perhaps they do." Maria, standing quietly to the side, said nothing. But her expression, calm, unreadable, spoke volumes. Moments later, the butler returned. "Miss Lena Brooks, sir." Lena entered quietly, carrying only a small brown envelope. Her attire was simple yet neat, the same modest blouse and skirt from before. Her eyes, however, seemed brighter, filled with quiet satisfaction. "Good afternoon, Mr. Knight," she said softly, offering a warm smile. Alexander gestured toward the seat across from Sophie. "Welcome back, Miss Brooks. I hope the task wasn't too burdensome." "Not at all," she replied. "It was enlightening." He nodded toward the envelope. "And that represents your choice." Lena held it out gently. "Yes, sir. Inside is the receipt of my purchases, toys, books, and supplies for St. Mary's Orphanage. I used only a small portion of the card. The rest remains untouched." Sophie gave a faint, amused chuckle. "You mean you didn't spend it on yourself? That's sweet, but surely he expected you to enjoy it." Lena turned toward her, unoffended. "I did enjoy it," Seeing the children smile was worth more than any designer dress. Her sincerity hung in the air like music, soft but impossible to ignore. Alexander's gaze lingered on her face, searching for pretense but found none. She radiated something he hadn't seen in years, pure goodness without agenda. He leaned back in his chair. "So you use the card not for luxury but for charity?" "Yes, sir," Lena said. "You asked me to buy what defined me. Helping others defines me." "It always has." The room fell into thoughtful silence. Maria looked at her employer subtly, as if asking without words, "Do you see it now?" Alexander rose from his seat and began to pace slowly, his polished shoes echoing faintly against the marble floor. "Two women," he said quietly. "Two very different choices. Miss Langford, you invested in image. Miss Brooks, you invested in others. Both say something true about you." Sophie lifted her chin proudly. "There is nothing wrong with wanting to look your best, Mr. Knight. I believe in excellence." Lena nodded gently. "And I believe excellence begins in the heart." For a moment their eyes met, a silent clash between vanity and virtue. Alexander stood still, studying both of them. "It seems both of you stayed true to your nature," he said finally. "And that was the purpose of the test." Sophie smiled, clearly believing she had impressed him. "So tell me, Mr. Knight, which of us passed?" He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Maria entered quietly, carrying a small brown envelope in her hands. "Forgive me for interrupting, sir," she said softly. "But I thought you should see this before you decide." Alexander turned, slightly puzzled. "Maria, what is that?" "It's something I bought yesterday, with what remained on your card." Both Sophie and Lena looked at her in surprise. Alexander frowned lightly. "You used the card?" "Without permission." Maria lowered her head respectfully. "I did, sir. But I believe when you see what it was for, you'll understand." She placed the envelope on the table. It was plain, no ribbons, no logos, no polish, just a single folded receipt and a hospital letter sealed inside. Alexander hesitated, then reached for it. He unfolded the paper slowly, and what he read made his composure falter for the first time in years. The room grew silent. The maid had spent the remaining balance, not on herself, not on luxuries, not even on her family, but to pay the medical bills of one of his former employees, a man who had been injured in a construction accident while working on one of Knight Enterprises' projects. The receipt bore the man's name, Daniel Harper. Alexander remembered him, loyal, hard-working, and humble. The accident had left him unable to work, and the company insurance had failed to cover all costs. He looked up slowly, his voice low. "Maria, why did you do this?" She met his gaze steadily. "Because, sir, his child needed surgery. And because I could not stand to see a good man suffer when we had the means to help." Her words hit him like thunder. Sophie stared in disbelief. Lena's eyes welled with tears. Alexander turned toward the fire, his hand tightening around the paper. In that moment, every wall he had built, every layer of arrogance, distrust, and cynicism began to crack. The test he had set for others had found its true subject. The silence stretched long and heavy. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. "You weren't even part of the challenge, Maria. And yet, you passed it without knowing it existed." Maria smiled humbly. "Perhaps because, sir, kindness doesn't need to be tested. It just needs to be practiced." Alexander exhaled deeply, looking down at the letter again. He felt something unfamiliar stir within his chest, shame, awe, and gratitude all at once. For the first time in years, Alexander Knight, the billionaire who trusted no one, felt truly humbled. The room fell utterly silent. For a few seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. Even the flickering flames in the fireplace seemed to pause, as Alexander Knight stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the hospital receipt in his trembling hand. He read the lines again, each word striking him deeper than the last. Patient, Daniel Harper. Procedure, pediatric heart surgery. Payment received in full. A lump formed in his throat. The ink on the receipt blurred slightly as his vision grew misty, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Across from him, Maria stood quietly, her posture humble yet dignified. Lena watched with tears gathering in her eyes, while Sophie sat stiffly, her polished smile faltering as reality began to sink in. Alexander finally looked up. "You paid this boy's medical bills." "With my card?" Maria nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." His tone wavered between disbelief and admiration. "Why?" "That money wasn't meant for you." Her answer came calmly, without hesitation. "Because, sir, it wasn't about me. You gave that card as a test of character. I saw a chance to make something right, something your company, perhaps unknowingly, left unfinished." He blinked. "My company?" She met his gaze steadily. "Daniel Harper worked on your lakeside residence project 5 years ago. He fell from scaffolding. The insurance covered some costs, but not enough for his son's heart surgery. I found out last week from one of the cleaning staff who still visits his family." Alexander felt as if the floor had dropped beneath him. He remembered Daniel, a loyal foreman who always greeted him with a firm handshake and an honest smile. He had signed the accident report, delegated it to the company's legal team, and never thought about it again, until now. He sank slowly into his chair, staring at the paper that had suddenly turned into a mirror, reflecting every neglected responsibility of his wealth. Sophie shifted uncomfortably, breaking the heavy silence. "Well, that's admirable," she said weakly. "But surely, Mr. Knight, she overstepped. I mean, she had no right to use your—" Alexander's voice cut through her words, quiet but sharp as glass. "No, right?" He turned toward her, his grey eyes glinting with a restrained storm. "She used what was left of the same card I gave you. She chose compassion over comfort. Tell me, Miss Langford, which of you truly understood the purpose of that test?" Sophie's lips parted, but no sound came out. The confidence she had worn like armor crumbled before the raw sincerity in his tone. I only wanted to show respect to your generosity," she stammered. "You said we could buy anything we wanted." "I did," Alexander said, standing slowly. "And you did exactly that. You bought for yourself." He turned to Maria, voice softening. "But she bought for someone who could never repay her. She spent my money, the same money I treat as power, and turned it into mercy." The words hung heavy in the air. Sophie lowered her gaze, color rising in her cheeks. For the first time, she seemed to see herself clearly, not as the dazzling socialite she prided herself on being, but as a hollow reflection of vanity. Without another word, she gathered her things quietly and stood. "I should go," she whispered. Alexander didn't stop her. Neither did Maria nor Lena. The sound of her heels faded down the marble hallway, leaving behind only silence and truth. When Sophie was gone, Alexander turned to Lena Brooks. "I saw the footage," he admitted softly. "You could have spent a fortune on yourself, yet you chose to give it all away." Lena shook her head gently. "Not all of it. I only used what I needed for the children. The rest belonged to you." He studied her, then said with quiet sincerity, "You remind me of what I used to believe in, before the world made me doubt it." She smiled kindly. "The world still has goodness in it, Mr. Knight. Sometimes it just hides behind too much noise." Alexander glanced down at the receipt once more, then folded it carefully, almost reverently. "You and Maria, both of you have done more with my card than I ever could. I've spent millions building towers, and somehow neither of you needed a single skyscraper to make an impact." Maria placed a gentle hand over her heart. "It's not about how much you give, sir. It's about how much love you put into the giving." For a man who had built his empire on logic, efficiency and control, those words struck like poetry, and for once, he didn't want to resist them. He stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the estate gardens. The sunlight filtered through, warm and golden, yet it felt different, as if the world outside had shifted with him. "When I handed that card to those women," he said quietly, "I thought I was testing human nature. I wanted to prove that everyone has a price." He turned back toward them. "But you've proven something else entirely. that integrity doesn't need an audience and compassion doesn't wait for permission. Maria smiled faintly. Then perhaps the test wasn't for them, sir. Perhaps it was for you. Her words echoed softly in the vast room. Alexander chuckled weakly, not in mockery but in surrender. It seems I failed my own test. Lena shook her head. No, Mr. Knight. You passed because you were willing to see the truth when it appeared. He nodded slowly, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. Maybe you're right. A deep calm filled the room. The man who once measured life in profits now stood humbled before two women who had measured it in compassion. Maria, he said after a moment, find Daniel Harper and his family. Tell them their medical costs, every one of them, will be covered for life. His son will have access to the best care, no matter the price. Maria's eyes glistened with gratitude. Thank you, sir. That will mean the world to them. He turned to Lena. And as for you, Miss Brooks, I intend to make a donation to St. Mary's Orphanage. You will oversee it personally. Lena's eyes widened. That's incredibly generous, Mr. Knight. Thank you. It's not generosity, he replied softly. It's redemption. The three of them shared a quiet moment. The billionaire, the teacher, and the maid, bound not by wealth or status, but by a newfound understanding of what true richness means. That night, after everyone had gone, Alexander sat alone in his study once more. The fire crackled softly beside him. On the table before him lay the black credit card, now scratched, slightly worn, and utterly meaningless. He turned it over in his hand, remembering how he once saw it as a symbol of control. But now it felt hollow, just a tool that had accidentally revealed his humanity. He placed it inside a drawer and closed it gently. Then he picked up the hospital receipt, the one Maria had handed him, and framed it in glass. He hung it above his desk, where his degrees and awards once stood. As he gazed at it, a tear, small but genuine, traced down his cheek. I gave away a card to test others, he whispered to himself, but discovered that the real test was of my own heart. The following morning, the golden light of dawn crept through the tall glass windows of the Knight estate, casting soft shadows across the marble floor. It was a new day, but for Alexander Knight, it felt like the first day of a new life. For years, he had risen at 5 in the morning, dressed sharply in his tailored suits, and buried himself in meetings, charts, and endless emails. He had built his empire on schedules and numbers. Yet for the first time, he woke without rushing to his office. Instead, he stood before the framed hospital receipt on his wall, the one Maria had brought him, and simply stared. The ink was ordinary, the paper unremarkable, but to him, it was now more valuable than all his stock certificates combined. He touched the glass lightly, as if the paper itself carried warmth. Money, he murmured, can buy comfort, but not conscience. A faint smile touched his lips, a fragile smile, one born from truth rather than pride. Over the next few days, subtle but profound changes began to ripple through his world. At the office, his employees were startled when Alexander called a meeting, not to discuss quarterly profits, but to listen. He stood before his staff, hands clasped behind his back, looking uncharacteristically humble. I've been running this company like a machine, he began. I built walls to protect myself, and in doing so, I stopped seeing the people behind the numbers. That changes today. The employees exchanged astonished glances. Their boss, the man once rumored to fire someone for being late to a meeting, was speaking with gentleness. I want to start a new initiative, he continued. A foundation in our company's name. We'll fund education for children of injured construction workers, cover hospital costs, and support families who've given us their labor and trust. He paused, his gaze softening. And this time no one will be left behind because of fine print. For a long moment there was silence. Then one by one, the employees began to applaud, slowly at first, then rising into a wave of genuine respect. Alexander felt something stir in him that he hadn't known in years. Fulfillment. Later that week, he found Maria in the garden, trimming the rose bushes as she always did. Her apron was streaked with soil, her hair tied back neatly. She looked up as he approached, and her face softened with a quiet smile. "You look different, sir," she said, placing down her shears. He smiled faintly. "Do I?" "Yes," she nodded. "You're standing lighter." "Like someone who finally let go of something heavy," he chuckled softly. "Maybe I have. I used to think kindness was weakness, that if I gave too much, people would use me. But you and Lena showed me something I forgot long ago." Maria tilted her head. "And what's that, sir?" "That wealth means nothing if it cannot heal what's broken." She looked at him for a long moment, then said gently, "Your father used to say something similar. I remember the first time I worked here. He told me that true power isn't control, it's compassion." Alexander nodded, emotion flickering in his eyes. "He did, and I buried that lesson under years of ambition." He turned his gaze toward the sunrise. "But I think I'm ready to live by it now." 2 weeks later, Alexander asked Maria to take him somewhere, not to a meeting or an estate, but to a small community hospital downtown. They walked through the narrow hallways until they reached a modest room filled with laughter. Inside, Daniel Harper sat beside a hospital bed, holding the hand of his son, Eli, a bright-eyed boy with a fragile smile and a heart monitor beside him. When Alexander entered, Daniel froze in shock. "Mr. Knight," he whispered, standing abruptly. "Sir, I didn't know you were coming." Alexander extended his hand. "I came to see how your son is doing, and to thank you for reminding me of the people my company was built upon." Daniel's eyes shimmered. "Sir, we can never thank you enough. You saved my boy's life." Alexander shook his head. "No, Daniel, Maria did. I just happened to give her the means." Eli looked up with innocent curiosity. "Are you the man with the magic card?" Alexander smiled, kneeling beside him. "Something like that. But I think the magic isn't in the card, Eli. It's in the people who use it for good." The boy giggled softly, squeezing his father's hand. As Alexander left the room, Maria noticed his expression, thoughtful, tender, and peaceful all at once. For the first time in his life, the billionaire who had measured everything in currency found something that couldn't be counted: gratitude. Back at the mansion, the grand halls that once echoed with silence now carried warmth. Staff members smiled more freely. Laughter returned to the dining room. Alexander no longer dined alone. Maria often joined him, and so did Lena, who had become a trusted partner in his charitable foundation. Together, they began visiting orphanages, funding schools, and providing shelter to widowed mothers. Every project carried a small symbol, a simple embossed card with the words, "Use this to make the world a little kinder." Whenever someone asked what it meant, Alexander would smile and reply, "A lesson learned from the most unexpected teachers." One quiet evening, as Alexander sat by the fire, he looked again at the framed hospital receipt. He thought of Sophie, who had disappeared from his world without a word. He wished her no harm, only hoped that one day she would find her own truth. He thought of Lena, whose selfless kindness reminded him that light could still exist in a world obsessed with appearances. And he thought of Maria, the maid who had taught him what millions could not buy, a human heart that still feels. He raised his glass of tea toward the fire, whispering softly, "I gave my credit card to test others, but what I found was the cost of losing my humanity. And thanks to them, I finally bought it back, not with money, but with mercy." The fire crackled gently, and somewhere deep inside him, the emptiness that had haunted him for years finally faded. As the night deepened outside, Alexander stepped onto his balcony, the city lights glowing beneath him. He closed his eyes and smiled, not the smile of a billionaire, but of a man reborn. Because in the end, the true measure of wealth is not what you keep, but what you give away.